My name's Simon Locke. I'm a board member of the Foreign Press Association. I'm with Ian Williams, the FPA's president. Ian has written books about the United Nations, has covered the Middle East for decades, and you have a unique insight and I think historical perspective to what's going on today. To what extent is what is happening unprecedented or different?
Well, it's very heavily precedented. It's deja vu all over again. We've seen the same characters keep appearing. But I think where it's unprecedented is the complete defiance of international law. In the past, the US was always very careful to wrap itself in a blue fig leaf. What they were doing was really what the UN had wanted, if it had allowed to. And they were always very careful to kosher or halal what they did afterwards with UN resolutions. And this time, there's absolutely no, there wasn't even an attempt because Trump has shown his contempt for the UN. So there's no attempt to prove that Iran has broken any UN resolutions, that Iran is defying international law. It's simply that Iran is our enemy and we're going to go and get it. And this is apparent in a degree of support. What's different this time is that because they've involved all of the neighbors in this, and not even the neighbors, because Britain's been implicated, this has become more like a global conflict. You know, if we're shouting, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, is shouting about how Iran has attacked its neighbors. Those neighbors were acting as bases for the American attack on Iran, which everybody objectively agrees was illegal, unprecedented, and fairly pointless, since nobody knows what the end game is.
So the killing of Iran's supreme leader um, is it's not something that we have consistently seen where one attacking nation actually goes after the leader of other nations. How different is that to past past conflicts?
Well, it's extremely provocative. You know, the if Hitler had survived World War II as a prisoner, he would have been tried. He wouldn't have been summarily blown up by a passing American bomber. There would have been a trial. Everyone would have insisted on it. In fact, you know, it was one of the big contentions with the victors. And, you know, as wars go, that was a fairly black and white one. But in this case, the Iranians are more syndicate. The Iranian state is more sinned against than sinning. It agreed a nuclear pact. It had signed a nuclear pact. It was abiding by a nuclear pact. And it was Donald Trump, the president of the US, who pulled out of that pact. Was not attacking its neighbors militarily, and it's never done that. I mean, all the talk about how bad it is. Yes, it was bad, but it's not taken any direct military action abroad. It's always responded. Iraq attacked, it defended itself, and Iran actually beat the Iraqis in the end, which was the end of that particular war. And in that war, the British and the French and the Americans all supported Iraq against Iran. We supported it with weapons, we supported it with finance. So we're not on actually the high moral ground here. Except you'd never guess that from looking at the American media or the major American media, because the basic principle is Iran is bad and Israel and the US are good. It's a principle that pervades almost all the coverage of it. In this case, I repeat, Iran has this is legally in the right. It agreed to nuclear terms, which, by the way, were once again, this sense of perspective comes in. Why is Israel, an undeclared nuclear state, insisting that Iran must not have nuclear weapons? I've always found, even in talking to Iranian diplomats, Iranian dissidents, they've always maintained, yes, we have every right to have a nuclear program, and we're not letting the Americans or the Israelis tell us not to. In fact, the Iranian nuclear program was started under the Shah with American support. So, you know, once again, the eternal principles are being waved around to justify fairly expedient results.
Well, it
And
does it does seem clear right now that you know, where once upon a time there would have been the UN would have been immediately involved and would have thought to have had some ability to maybe influence the states involved. Um, Maybe with a board of peace and with the way the US is looking at the UN, it seems like the UN's role this time will be very different from clearly in the past.
the Board of Peace is a means of evading the UN's rules and regulations. It's trying to set up a similar body to achieve. I mean, it's appointed by. We worry about the veto from other countries, but the Board of Peace is basically Donald Trump's personal emissary for the world, and he has spent so long denigrating the United Nations that it's difficult to see, part of the, let's say, the usefulness of the UN is it had a certain stature, and it always provided a ladder for contending parties who climbed up a tree to climb down gracefully. And that's what's missing this time. They've all climbed up a tree, and there's no way for them to climb down, and the UN really can't provide a fig leaf. It will be called in the end, almost certainly. But in the old days, the Secretary General's good officers, U Tant or Kofi Annan, would go in there. Uh, in the case of the Iraq War, you might remember Kofi Annan famously said that diplomacy is very effective, especially when it's backed up by the threat of armed force. When Saddam Hussein was going off the rails. But the UN needs support, and it's been completely hollowed out by the continual war of attrition by by Donald Trump. In fact, I could say it's symbolic, but the fact that the first lady is being sent to chair a meeting in the UN Security Council is a moral derogation of the United Nations. You know,
So there are sort of echoes, I believe, of the Iraq War when George Bush uh, was given intelligence or shared intelligence that said, here are the reasons why we're attacking weapons of mass destruction. I believe you've told me in the past that, you're one of the people who was actually questioning whether or not, that was actually really the case or whether or not the information was being used to fit the objective. Um,
the information was being used to fit the objective. It was expedient information. It was almost on a par with the Nazis killing Poles and putting them on the border and saying that the Poles had invaded in 1939. It was spurious. We had this before. Uh, People of a certain age will remember the Tonkin Gulf incident in which the US manufactured an attack on a US destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin to justify intensification of the Vietnam War. How did that end up for you? How did the Iraq War end up for you? So, I mean, this one is not going to end well, not just for the US, though, but for everybody, because it has this possibility of snowballing out of control. Nobody's in control because several of the parties there are not totally rational. You have Donald Trump, whose main concern is to avoid the midterm elections and to get control, as some people have suggested. He wants to nationalize the military, the control of the midterm elections, which he's likely to win because of the lose because of the Epstein file. So he wants to use the war powers invoked by Iran to do it. That is one scenario that's being discussed. We have Netanyahu, who is well, beleaguered legally at home and is unpopular in Israel, but as we've shown, needs a war, whether it's Gaza or Iran. And finally, we have Iran now, where there was this sort of element of rationality, even if theological ferocity, but we don't know where is in Iran now. Now, I'm sure there's a leadership and they have a procedure, and it's not just it isn't just a one-man dictatorship with the Ayatollah. It does have a structure. It does have a base. And that, well, where can we go from there? Other people have been now being brought in. I mean, we got the poodles yapping, mentioning in particular Keir Starmer, who is it started off by declaring the war illegal and has now said he's in support of the other countries because they participated in a legal war against Iran and the Iranians fought back. The old sign on the Paris Zoo on the lion's cage was these animals are dangerous. When a, when attacked, they fight back. And
You know, it reminds me of I think the historical precedents, that the challenges, the lessons maybe from Vietnam, the lessons from Afghanistan, the lessons from Iraq. Um, these clearly do not seem to be a guide for action, and it's clear that for the administration, the way it's being framed is there was a once in a generation opportunity both to attack and for regime change ultimately. Um, there's a way of thinking about it where if regime change actually happens and a better regime comes in place, you could look at this and say, well, actually, maybe that was a good outcome. Or is this really, what's the likelihood of that type of a scenario? Or do we look at this as saying basically this is a roll of the dice, and if it comes up trumps, all will be well, but there's a lot of other risks that actually it is not going to go as well as people expect.
it's a huge number of risks. And I see no signs that the Trump White House or the Netanyahu administration is in any way dealing rationally or has thought this through. It's spasmodic vindictiveness on their part. And, we have the Washington is filled with sycophants. The president has spent a year and a half destroying all opposition. Anybody who's given advice that wasn't what he wanted, he's got rid of. Anyone said yes, but has been bombed out. He has a cabinet of yes people, and not just yes people, but fairly low IQ yes people who have shown signs that they do not consider the consequences of their actions, even when it's self-defeating for them. So it really bodes very, very badly for the world, I think. As I said, the economy, but also the military. I mean, this can escalate. China has said that they support Iran's right to self-defense. Putin has got his own hands full, but they're watching because this is the this is draws a line under the United Nations in the 1945. I mean, we've drawn so many lines under it, but basically every principle of international relations and international law has been ripped up here. It's an unprecedented, unprovoked attack on a member state of the United Nations, and no matter how much they scream about it, that's the way the rest of the world is looking. And the first thing is how bad the US is. The second one is if the US can do it, why can't I do it? Why can't China swoop on Taiwan? What's wrong with Trump attacking Ukraine if the US can do it? All of the principles that we invoke in all of the other conflicts are just thrown out the window. There's no
I think
principles
you meant
involved.
what's wrong with Putin attacking Ukraine, right? It's that, but
Been there,
so
done that, yes.
yeah, so
Yeah,
you
but
look at that
we're
and say,
condemning Putin for doing exactly what's happened here.
right.
I mean, even the language. Saw the Republican senator last week who was talking about the. It was a special operation. I thought, God, did Putin write the speech? It wasn't a war. It was a special military operation. And she was saying, no, no, the president didn't declare war because that would have needed the War Powers Act. It was a special operation. I was wondering if there was some Japanese general in Tokyo saying, "Oh, Pearl Harbor, it's not declaring war, Your Imperial Majesty. It's just a sort of demonstration, a quick military action, and
I think
they have
I think
consequences."
that there are many who will say that maybe the ends or some who will say that the end's going to justify the means, right? It's like, oh, we got took an opportunity, we took that opportunity. Yes, there are risks. Yes, there are consequences and will be U.S. casualties, but that has to assume that the outcome, assuming there is a regime change or there is a more friendly regime, realistically, if threw rolled the dice and you came up with a full house, what does Iran actually then look like? Should the US one more time naively expect the Iranians to go, well, we should be embracing US democracy. We should be embracing what the US is trying to kind of build. What do you see in the best case scenario as an outcome?
Well, before we get to the best case scenario, uh, this was tried in Afghanistan, it was tried in Iraq, it was tried in Vietnam. How did that work out for you? Tried regime change, it failed. The regime that came was not what we wanted, or not what Washington wanted. And I say we. Um, it was unprecedented. And it's got worse. You have the Taliban in Afghanistan. We have a shaky regime in Iraq that can't control its own territory, and which the pro-Iranian militia are using as a base to bomb Americans. Um, we have all of the states in the Gulf, and people forget, they assume everyone shares their opinions. Poll after poll shows it for the great American public and in the Middle East, Israel is toxic. There's still the pervasive idea here that Israel is a sort of wonderful, civilized Western country, and most people support it. That's not true in most of the world, and it's particularly not true in the Gulf regimes. I think they are going to be fragile. Even MBS in Saudi Arabia, there are differences between Shias and Sunnis, but they're not as significant as being made out by analysts and provocateurs. Um, and in the end, they're seeing fellow Muslims being penalized by Western powers and by Israel. And that's a toxic combination. I really worry about the consequences all around. And if I were in Riyadh with MBS, and if I were in the Emirates in particular, where basically you have a sort of slaveocracy with 10% of the population as citizens, as a very small minority, ruling over a disenfranchised bunch of foreigners and Shias. Um, they've, it wouldn't take too much for things to go haywire there. And, whatever it is, whatever ensues is going to be devastated and shattered, I think. So he's really thrown a bomb into the whole region, and is going to act surprised when it blows up. The last thing he's going to do is say, "I told you so," and we should be saying, "We tell you so now, and we'll tell you so again."
Well, I think one of the key arguments that would be made is that in this context of America first, it's like, well, we are treating America first. We're making America safer. But what do you think about the idea of continuing where you were going? Does this make America safer if you have the best possible outcome?
Well, the best possible outcome would be to stop now, which is a pretty bad outcome because the deed's already been done. There's no good outcome from this that I can see. The Iranians aren't going to surrender, I don't believe. I think the regime has enough resilience. They have the forces, and the only way to defeat them is to put boots on the ground, as the famous saying has it. Now, the Israelis' maneuver has always been to get the American boots on the ground, which a lot of the more clear-sighted, pragmatic American commanders realized, and they've avoided it like hell because they know this is boots on the ground means they lose their souls in every sense. Um, and they tried to avoid this. So we're going to have an inconclusive end at best. And we're going to leave a lot of very embittered people in the region. And we're going to have a lot of people in the rest of the world saying, who are these people? They were never going to listen to a word they say about democracy, about rule of the law, and the rest of it. Again, you know,
The assumption is the assumption is often that, and it's a dangerous assumption, is to assume that Iranians are of a like mind, right? That is one uh, monolithic viewpoint and perspective. It's either going to be for the regime or against the regime, rather than to reflect, which is what we would be seeing in the United States or anywhere else, right? There's going to be a significant diversity of perspective. So we haven't so far necessarily seen the and maybe it's just simply too dangerous to be out in the streets to be doing stuff. But we have seen protests, and there have been some counter protests. Now, what does that tell us about where we are? Maybe it tells us nothing. And the key thing that we have to think about is simply that this will take time, right? The repercussions are not going to be immediately apparent.
well, look, the Iranian society does have big splits, obviously. We don't know because they haven't actually had votes. But it's been a functioning society, functioning badly in some ways, but the regime has a base of popular support based on a theocracy, just as the Pope has the support of many Catholics, even ones who disagree with his policies. You know, and in this case, you have a foreign enemy. The general lesson of history is if you want to win hearts and minds, you don't drop bombs on them.
Well,
I mean, if you remember in Vietnam, we spoke about hearts and minds and then raked it with napalm and bombs and then wondered why they threw us out in an ignominious defeat, which, seems to be conveniently forgotten in the United States. And then we have the subservient puppets, really, like Keir Starmer, who is going to get voted out because he's got no popular basis. Even in the US, there's no popular basis for support for war against Iran. In the UK, there's even less. In most of Europe, there's less. But the regimes in all of these countries are sort of kowtowing to Donald Trump and to the US administration and to Netanyahu and saying, "Yes, we support you." Well, when the bombs have already started hitting the British bases in Cyprus. Um, once the body bags start coming home from all of these people who are foolish enough to go to fight for America and Israel, then I think we're going to see repercussions back home as well.
as a way to wrap this all up, I was listening to John Bolton, who's been one of our regular Foreign Press Association guests, and you've interviewed him many times. And I've heard him talk about the idea that, in principle, that regime change was not a bad thing. I think
I
he
don't
was.
think regime change is necessarily itself bad. I was very happy when Milosevic was overthrown in the former Yugoslavia. I did not shed many. Mark Twain said it best. I wish no man dead, but I often read obituaries with a great deal of pleasure, which
Well, so I think
summed
that.
up Saddam Hussein and to some extent the Ayatollah as well.
Well, and one of the things that I think he's been very articulate about was the idea of going, well, the idea of regime change is something that, he said he supported, but at the same time, he was then basically saying that the problem with the administration and the approach, it's about the approach. It's about, is there
They're
joined up,
incompetent.
yeah, is there joined up thinking? Now,
Yes.
I would kind of.
You might say that you need an engine change in your car, but you don't get the local scrap butcher to do it for you. You want some seriously competent people to do a political and military enterprise on this scale, and there's no signs of that.
Well, so one of the things I would wonder about and get your perspective as the to wrap up, which would be, on the one hand, you go, is it really this been approached with a level of strategy and thinking that would be required to achieve its success. There's another level which you would look at it and say this comes back to the UN. You know, if you look at it as sequence of actions that the administration has taken, the establishment of renaming of the Defense Department as the Department of War, the gutting of the UN, the really unquestioning support of what was going on in Gaza. Um, in a way, they all sort of seem to lead us to a point where you get to an administration that does appear, without asking Congress for the authority uh, to enter a war, using the fig leaf as obviously of the idea of special operation as you talked about. Do you see a level of joined up thinking that may not actually be in the practice of um, what is actually being done, but a sequence of events that you might look at and say, well, actually, there does seem to have been a strategic approach that kind of got us to this place.
Well, I see no signs of a strategic approach. It's a series of spasmodic reflexes based on various prejudices and immediate interests. Like, does the president's family want to own a Riviera type resort on the Gulf? You know, I mean, I know it sounds silly, but that's what happened in Gaza. I have to remember that his policy was negotiated by real estate dealers who saw a piece of prime property. They never saw the 2 million people getting bombed at Stone Ages. And it's this lack of foresight that's so apparent. The truism which many liberals will come up with is there's always two sides to every question. No, there aren't. There are many, many sides. And unless you can juggle all of these various factors together, then you're heading for disaster because there's always, you're juggling and then one of your balls goes off into the distance. What do you do? And this is what happens. This is juggling with multiple balls, all of which have a mind of their own, and it's bound to come unstuck. It has come unstuck already.
Well, Ian, thanks very much indeed. If you had one word for our for member journalists or for journalists or the media, and can be more than one word, that you would say, given your experience, that it is really important to be mindful of as they are thinking about, writing about, talking about what is going on today. What would be the bit of advice that you would give to journalists and the media that are covering this today?
Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone. Because, I mean, the few of us that actually called out the Iraq war are now joined by lots of people, including Trump and all the major mainstream press that were trumpeting for the war. Uh, Stand your ground now, and you might get fired, but posterity will reward you. You have to look objectively at what's happening and not be scared of the prejudices and the lemming-like rush of all of the others. I've got to stand by my president, right or wrong. No, you don't. It's bad for America, it's bad for the West, and it's bad for humanity.
So, have you cashed in your posterity checks recently?
Often, often.
Well, look, thanks very much indeed, Ian. Much appreciated.
Right. Bye.
Thanks.